The blizzard had been raging for 2 days when Silas Crawford finally swallowed his pride and stumbled through waist-deep snow toward the low opening in the hillside. Inside Cyrus Thornwell's buried shelter, the temperature held steady at 70 degrees, while Crawford's own cabin, despite a fire that had consumed half a cord of wood, couldn't break 20. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity like this one speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The wind carried voices through the darkness, muffled by snow but desperate enough to cut through the storm's howl. Cyrus Thornwell set down the book he had been reading by lamplight and listened. Someone was outside. Multiple people, actually, judging by the confused shouting. He rose from his chair and moved toward the entrance of his shelter, a low opening barely 4 feet high that descended at a slight angle into the earth. He pushed open the inner door first, then the outer, and frigid air poured down the entrance tunnel, though it barely penetrated 10 feet before the warmth of his shelter repelled it. 3 figures stood in the snow, their forms barely visible in the whiteout conditions. The lead figure stumbled forward, and Cyrus recognized Silas Crawford's voice even before he saw the man's frost-covered face. "Thornwell," Crawford's voice cracked. "My children, they're freezing, all of us. The cabin won't hold heat." Behind Crawford stood Peter Donovan and his wife Martha. Even through the blowing snow, Cyrus could see they were shaking violently. He stepped back without a word and gestured them inside. They had to crouch to enter, crawling almost through the low tunnel. But once they emerged into the main chamber, they stopped and stared. The shelter was a single room, roughly 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, carved directly into the clay hillside. Wooden support beams crossed the ceiling in a grid pattern, holding back tons of earth and snow above. A small fire burned in a clay fireplace built into the far wall, its chimney disappearing up through the earthen roof. The temperature in the space was warm enough that Cyrus wore only a wool shirt, no coat, no layers. Just comfortable warmth that seemed impossible given the hell raging outside. Martha Donovan began weeping. Not from cold now, but from the shock of heat after 2 days of slowly freezing despite every fire they could manage. Crawford stood near the entrance, dripping melted snow, his expression cycling through relief, confusion, and something that might have been shame. "There are others," Crawford said finally. "The Erickson family, the Harrisons. Everyone's cabins are failing." Cyrus nodded. "Bring them. There's room." Crawford disappeared back into the storm. Cyrus added another log to his fire, though the shelter barely needed it. The earth surrounding them held heat like a massive stone. The snow piled on the roof above added even more insulation. He had built this space to be warm, and it was working exactly as he had calculated it would. Peter Donovan moved closer to the fire, extending his hands. His wife sat heavily on one of the simple benches Cyrus had built along the wall. Neither spoke. They were too exhausted, too cold still in their cores, too overwhelmed by the contrast between this warmth and the frozen nightmare they had just escaped. More voices approached from outside. The story of why Cyrus Thornwell dug a hole in the ground and called it home began 14 months earlier on a November morning in 1855 when Peter Donovan knocked on Cyrus's cabin door just after dawn. Cyrus had been awake for an hour already, stoking his fire and preparing coffee. He opened the door to find Peter standing in the early light, his right hand wrapped in cloth that was spotted with blood. "Need your help getting to the settlement," Peter said. His voice was steady, but his face was gray. "Something's wrong with my hand." They rode together, Peter cradling his wrapped hand against his chest. The settlement was 12 miles east, a collection of buildings clustered around a trading post. The doctor, a man named Williams, who had learned medicine during the Mexican War, unwrapped Peter's hand in his cramped office and went silent for a long moment. 3 fingers on Peter's right hand were black from the second knuckle to the tips. Not frostbitten purple or red, but dead black. Williams looked up at Peter with the expression of a man delivering news he had given too many times before. "When did this happen?" "Woke up this morning and they were like that," Peter said. "Been cold the last few nights. Kept the fire going, but the cabin gets cold anyway. Didn't think much of it. Williams began preparing his instruments. Cyrus waited outside while the doctor amputated 2 fingers at the middle knuckle. The 3rd finger Williams managed to save, though he said it would never bend properly again. Peter emerged an hour later, his hand freshly bandaged, moving like a man who had aged 10 years and 60 minutes. They rode back in silence until they were within sight of Peter's cabin. Then Peter spoke without looking at Cyrus. "I kept the fire going all night. I did everything right. And I still lost 2 fingers inside my own home." Cyrus looked at Peter's cabin as they approached. It was identical to his own. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with moss and mud, a single door, 1 window covered with oiled paper, a bark and sod roof. Standard construction. The kind of cabin thousands of settlers built across the frontier. The kind that was supposed to keep you safe. That night, Cyrus lay in his own cabin and could not sleep. His fire burned low, and the cold crept in through invisible gaps. He rose and fed the fire, and warmth pushed back for a while, but within an hour the cold returned. He fed the fire again. The cycle continued through the night. Fire, warmth, cold, fire, warmth, cold. An endless battle that consumed wood and energy and still allowed the cold to win more often than not. Peter Donovan had lost 2 fingers inside a shelter that was supposed to protect him. That single fact lodged in Cyrus's mind like a splinter. He began paying attention to things he had always ignored. The draft that came through the doorframe, no matter how carefully he sealed it. The way heat rose straight to the ceiling and disappeared through the roof. The gaps between logs that seemed small but multiplied into significant openings when you counted all of them. The amount of firewood he burned each night just to maintain barely tolerable temperatures. Other settlers accepted these realities without question. Winter was cold. Cabins were imperfect. You burned wood and endured. That was simply how things were. But Cyrus could not accept it anymore. Peter's blackened fingers had changed something fundamental in how he saw the structure around him. His cabin was not protection. It was barely adequate shelter, and in the worst conditions, it failed completely. He began measuring temperatures with a mercury thermometer he had brought from Pennsylvania. Cyrus began his study on the 1st of December, 1855. He recorded temperatures at dawn, midday, and midnight. He measured the interior temperature near the floor, at chest height, and near the ceiling. He tracked how much firewood he consumed each day. He noted wind conditions and exterior temperatures. Other settlers would have called this obsessive. Cyrus called it necessary. The numbers told a brutal story. On a calm day with exterior temperatures around 20 degrees, his cabin interior averaged 38 degrees near the floor and 45 degrees at chest height, even with a fire burning steadily. Near the ceiling, the temperature reached 60 degrees, which meant most of his heat was gathering in a space he could not use. On windy days, the interior temperature dropped 10 degrees regardless of how much wood he burned. The wind found every gap, every crack, every imperfect seal, and pulled heat out of the cabin faster than the fire could generate it. He calculated that he was burning roughly 40 pounds of firewood every 24 hours just to maintain temperatures that were barely tolerable. Over a 4-month winter, that meant 4,800 pounds of wood, nearly 2.5 tons. All of that cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking just to stay marginally warm. Cyrus examined the construction of his cabin with new eyes. The corner notches that seemed clever and traditional were actually structural weaknesses. Each notch created a gap where logs did not meet completely. The chinking between logs compressed over time, opening cracks. The doorframe had shrunk slightly as the wood dried, creating a gap along one side that let in a constant draft. The window was covered with oiled paper that moved visibly when wind blew. The roof, layers of bark and sod over pole rafters, was the worst offender. Heat rose naturally, and the roof offered minimal resistance to that heat escaping into the sky. He mentioned his observations to Peter Donovan when he visited to check on his healing hand. Peter listened politely, then shrugged. "It's winter, Cyrus. Cabins are cold. That's just how it is." "It doesn't have to be." Cyrus said. "You planning to rebuild your cabin?" "I'm planning to build something different." Peter looked at him with mild concern. "Different how?" Cyrus did not answer because he did not yet know. He only knew that the current approach was fundamentally flawed. Log cabins fought against winter by creating a barrier between inside and outside. But that barrier was imperfect. It leaked constantly. It required enormous amounts of fuel to maintain. And in the worst conditions, it failed catastrophically, as Peter's blackened fingers proved. Cyrus visited other cabins in the scattered settlement. He found the same problems everywhere. Silas Crawford's cabin had a gap along the roofline where settling had opened a crack wide enough to see daylight. Lars Eriksson's cabin had a door that fit so poorly that snow drifted inside during storms. The Harrison family's cabin had chinking that had fallen out in several places, leaving gaps between logs that were 2 inches wide. Everyone accepted these flaws. They repaired what they could and endured the rest. When Cyrus suggested that perhaps the entire approach to cabin building was wrong, people looked at him as if he had suggested abandoning shelter entirely. "What else would we build?" Silas Crawford asked. "Stone? That takes even longer than logs, and we'd still need timber for the roof." "I don't know yet," Cyrus admitted. Crawford laughed. "When you figure it out, let me know. Until then, I'll stick with what works." But it did not work. That was the truth everyone ignored. It worked. Barely, inadequately, at the cost of enormous labor and constant discomfort, and sometimes it did not work at all. In January of 1856, Cyrus rode west for 3 days to reach a Lakota winter camp he had heard about from a trader. He arrived in late afternoon and was greeted with cautious hospitality. He explained through a mixture of signs and broken Lakota phrases that he wanted to understand how they built their winter lodges. An elder named Mapia agreed to show him. The earth lodges were partially sunken into the ground, their walls a combination of wooden posts and packed earth, their roofs covered with layers of willow branches, grass, and soil. Inside, the temperature was remarkably stable, warm, but not from a large fire. The central fire pit held only modest flames, yet the interior was comfortable enough that children played without heavy clothing. Mapia explained through gestures and simple words that the earth held heat. He placed Cyrus's hand against the earthen wall. It was warm to the touch, radiating the heat that had been absorbed and was now being slowly released. The elder pointed to the roof, thick with soil, and then to the ground. The earth protected them above and below. Cyrus spent 2 days observing. He noticed how the entrance was designed as a covered passage that prevented wind from blowing directly into the living space. He saw how the smoke hole was positioned to create draw without allowing heat to escape rapidly. He watched how moisture was managed through careful ventilation. These lodges had been refined over generations, and they worked far better than any log cabin he had seen. When he returned to his own settlement, he visited the root cellar behind the trading post. The structure was dug 8 feet into the ground with a timber roof covered in earth. He descended the stairs and stood in the darkness, noting the temperature. It was cool, perhaps 45 degrees, despite exterior temperatures that had dropped below zero the night before. Vegetables stored here did not freeze. The earth protected them. Cyrus remembered the coal mines of Pennsylvania from his youth, before he had come west. His father had worked briefly in the mines, and Cyrus had visited the entrance several times. Miners spoke of how the temperature underground stayed constant year-round, cool in summer when the surface baked, warm in winter when the surface froze. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature became. 3 separate observations that pointed to the same truth. Earth was not just stable ground to build upon. Earth itself was insulation, thermal mass, and protection. It maintained temperature naturally, without fuel, without effort. A log cabin fought against winter by creating a thin barrier that leaked constantly. But Earth, if you could use it properly, did not fight winter. It simply existed at its own temperature, steady and reliable, regardless of what happened on the surface above. Cyrus began sketching plans that night, not for a cabin, for something entirely different. Cyrus selected his site in late February of 1856, choosing a hillside 200 yards from his existing cabin. The slope faced south for maximum sunlight, and the soil composition was ideal. He dug test holes and found clay-heavy earth that would hold its shape when excavated. The hillside would provide natural drainage, preventing groundwater from seeping into his shelter. The location was higher than the creek, safe from flooding. Most importantly, the hill itself would become his walls and roof. He began digging on March 1st. The ground was still partially frozen, which made the work brutal. His pickaxe rang against hard earth, sending vibrations up his arms with each strike. He worked from dawn until his hands bled, then wrapped them and continued. He was excavating a chamber 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the hillside, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. The mathematics of removal were staggering. Roughly 1,300 cubic feet of earth and rock had to be carried out by hand. After 5 days, Silas Crawford rode up the hill and sat on his horse, watching Cyrus work. Crawford said nothing for several minutes, just observed as Cyrus swung the pick and shoveled earth into a wooden wheelbarrow. "What exactly are you doing, Thornwell?" Cyrus paused, leaning on his shovel. "Building a shelter." "By digging a hole?" "Yes." Crawford shook his head slowly. "You've lost your mind. You know that, don't you? You're digging your own grave up here." Cyrus returned to his work without responding. Crawford watched for another minute, then rode away. But he had planted a seed. Over the following weeks, other settlers rode up to observe the strange spectacle of Cyrus Thornwell excavating a massive pit in the hillside. Some asked questions. Most just stared and left, shaking their heads. The work consumed March and April entirely. Cyrus widened the entrance, tunnel, creating a passage 4 feet high and 6 feet long that angled gently downward into the main chamber. This design would create an airlock effect, preventing wind from blowing directly into the living space. Cold air would settle in the lower tunnel while warm air remained in the chamber. By late April, the basic excavation was complete. Cyrus stood inside the raw earthen chamber, his lamp casting shadows on clay walls. The space felt like a cave, which in essence it was. But it was a carefully engineered cave. The ceiling was level. The walls were vertical where they needed to be, angled where that provided better stability. The floor was flat and compacted. Children from the settlement began calling it the Badger Hole. Adults called it Thornwell's Folly. Silas Crawford started referring to Cyrus as the Mole. The name spread. Even Lars Eriksson, who was generally kind, expressed concern that Cyrus was wasting an entire season on something that would likely collapse or flood with the first heavy rain. Cyrus ignored them all and began the next phase. The challenge was not creating the void. The challenge was keeping thousands of pounds of earth from collapsing into it. Cyrus spent the first week of May cutting and hauling timber for support beams. He selected pine logs 8 inches in diameter, straight and free of significant knots. Each beam had to bear weight without bending or cracking under sustained pressure. He installed the primary supports first. Vertical posts set 3 feet apart along both side walls. These posts extended from the compacted floor to the ceiling. Each one sunk 6 inches into the ground for stability. He wedged them tight against the earthen ceiling, using wooden shims to ensure they carried load immediately. Then came the crossbeams, horizontal logs that spanned the width of the chamber, resting on top of the vertical posts and pressed firmly against the ceiling earth. The grid pattern distributed weight across multiple points. If one beam weakened, others would carry the load. Cyrus tested each connection, hanging his full weight from crossbeams to ensure they would not shift. The framework created a wooden skeleton that held back the earth's tendency to collapse inward. He had seen similar support structures in the Pennsylvania coal mines, and he adapted the principles to his smaller scale. The fireplace required different engineering. Cyrus built it into the back wall, carving a niche for the firebox and constructing the structure from clay mixed with sand and small stones. He shaped the firebox carefully, creating a throat that would channel smoke upward efficiently. The chimney angled up through the earth at a deliberate slope, emerging 12 feet behind the shelter's entrance at ground level. Building a chimney through solid earth presented problems no stonemason had written about. Cyrus lined the chimney passage with flat stones mortared together with his clay mixture, creating a flue that would not collapse. He made it narrow, only 8 inches in diameter, which created strong draft while minimizing heat loss. At the top, he built a simple cap from stones to prevent rain from pouring directly down into his fire. The entrance required equal attention. Cyrus framed the tunnel with timber, creating a structural support that would prevent the entrance from gradually widening and weakening. He built 2 door frames, one at the exterior opening and one where the tunnel met the main chamber. Each door would be thick wood, creating an airlock. Cold air could enter the tunnel, but it would settle there, unable to reach the warm chamber beyond the second door. He carved shallow drainage channels along both sides of the entrance tunnel, angling them to carry water away from the shelter. Spring runoff or heavy rain would flow into these channels and exit downhill, never entering his living space. By mid-June, the structural work was complete. Cyrus stood inside his earth chamber, surrounded by the timber framework, the clay fireplace curing slowly, the entrance properly supported and drained. The shelter was engineered. Now it needed to become a home. But first, it needed to survive the community's judgment. Cyrus moved into his earth shelter on July 9, 1856. He carried his possessions down the entrance tunnel in stages: his bed frame and mattress, his small table and 2 chairs, his trunk of clothes, his cooking equipment, and his books. The process took most of the day. Each time he emerged from the low entrance, carrying another load down into the earth, he felt the stares of anyone who happened to be watching from the settlement below. By evening, his old cabin stood empty, and his new home was furnished. He lit his first fire in the clay fireplace and watched smoke rise smoothly through the chimney. The draw was excellent. Within an hour, the earth chamber was comfortably warm. He sat at his table, ate a simple dinner, and read by lamplight. The silence was profound. No wind whistled through gaps. No drafts moved the lamp flame, just stillness and warmth. The community's reaction began the next Sunday when families gathered at the trading post. Cyrus arrived to purchase supplies and found himself the subject of barely concealed whispers. Sarah Crawford, Silas's wife, made a point of asking loudly if he was really living in that hole in the ground. When he confirmed that he was, she exchanged glances with the other women that communicated everything without words. The children were more direct. A boy of about 10 approached him and asked if he was part Badger. His friends laughed from a safe distance. Cyrus ignored them, completed his purchases, and left. But the nickname stuck. Within a week, everyone called his shelter the Badger's Den. Some people used the phrase with humor, others used it with contempt. Silas Crawford organized a barn raising for a new settler named John Harrison in late July. The entire community participated, turning the construction into a social event with food and music. Cyrus was not invited. He heard about it only when Lars Eriksson mentioned it in passing, then looked embarrassed when he realized Cyrus had not been asked to help. "It's not personal," Lars said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Silas is just. He thinks you've made some odd choices lately. Living in a properly insulated shelter is an odd choice?" Lars shifted uncomfortably. "Living in a hole in the ground, Cyrus, you have to admit it's strange. People wonder if you're losing your sense." Even Peter Donovan, whose maimed hand should have made him understand, kept his distance. He visited once in August, peering into the entrance tunnel but refusing to come inside. He stood at the threshold, looking down into the earth, and Cyrus could see the discomfort in his face. "It's not natural," Peter said finally. "Men aren't meant to live underground like animals. Men aren't meant to lose fingers to frostbite inside their own homes either," Cyrus replied. Peter had no answer to that. He left without entering, and he did not visit again. The first cold snap arrived in early November, 2 weeks earlier than usual. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees overnight, and frost covered everything by dawn. Cyrus woke in his earth shelter and checked his thermometer. The interior temperature was 62 degrees. His fire had burned down to coals during the night, yet the space remained comfortably warm. The earth walls had absorbed heat during the evening and were now radiating it back slowly, steadily, requiring no fuel to maintain livable temperatures. He rebuilt his fire using 3 small logs, just enough to heat water for coffee and bring the temperature back to 68 degrees. He noted the wood consumption in the journal he had been keeping. 3 logs. In his old cabin, a night this cold would have required constant fire feeding and would have consumed at least 20 pounds of wood. He had used perhaps 6 pounds. Over the following week, temperatures continued dropping. Cyrus monitored his firewood usage carefully. He was burning approximately half of what he had consumed in his old cabin for the same period last year. The earth shelter simply did not lose heat the way a log cabin did. The surrounding clay held warmth like a massive storage battery, releasing it gradually rather than letting it escape into the cold air outside. He noticed another phenomenon as snow began to fall. The first snowfall deposited 4 inches across the hillside, covering the earth roof above his shelter. Inside, the temperature actually increased slightly. The snow was acting as additional insulation, trapping heat that would have otherwise conducted through the soil into the frigid air. With 6 inches of snow on the roof, his shelter became even more efficient. He could let his fire burn down to nothing for hours, and the interior temperature would drop only 2 or 3 degrees. Peter Donovan visited in late November, arriving on horseback in early afternoon. He dismounted and stood looking at the low entrance for a long moment before Cyrus emerged. "Heard you've been living in there for 4 months now," Peter said. "I have. Heard you're barely burning any wood." "That's accurate." Peter hesitated, then asked, "Can I see inside?" Cyrus stepped aside and gestured toward the entrance. Peter crouched and made his way down the tunnel, moving awkwardly with his maimed hand. When he emerged into the main chamber, he stopped and looked around slowly. The space was warm despite the small fire in the fireplace. The earthen walls were smooth, almost polished from Cyrus's work. The timber support beams formed a geometric pattern across the ceiling. It was not crude or primitive. It was deliberate and functional. "How warm is it in here?" Peter asked. 68 degrees right now. My cabin was 42 degrees this morning, with a fire that had been burning all night." Cyrus said nothing. Peter stood in the warmth for several minutes, flexing the fingers that remained on his right hand, the stumps of the amputated ones visible. Finally, he spoke quietly. "You were right. The blizzard arrived on January 14th, 1857, without warning. The morning had been cold but clear. By noon, clouds moved in from the northwest, heavy and dark. By 2 in the afternoon, snow was falling so thick that visibility dropped to 20 feet. By evening, the wind had risen to a howl that shook the walls of every log cabin in the settlement. Silas Crawford's family huddled near their fireplace, feeding log after log into flames that seemed to provide less warmth with each passing hour. The wind found every gap in the cabin's construction and exploited it mercilessly. Cold air poured through invisible cracks around the door, through gaps in the chinking, through the space where the roof met the walls. Sarah wrapped blankets around their 3 children, but the blankets could not stop the shivering. By midnight, the water bucket near the fire had a skin of ice on its surface. Silas stared at that ice and felt something close to panic. They were freezing inside their own home, despite a fire that was consuming wood faster than he could feed it. He checked his woodpile, half gone already, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Peter Donovan's cabin was failing even faster. A gap had opened along the roofline where settling had separated one wall from the ceiling beams. Snow was drifting inside, piling in the corner. Martha held their youngest child against her chest, trying to share body heat. Peter fed the fire continuously, but the temperature inside the cabin hovered around 18 degrees. He could see his breath. His children's lips were turning blue. The Harrison family abandoned their cabin first, around 2 in the morning on the second day. Their door had warped badly, and wind was blowing through a gap wide enough to fit a hand through. They wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned and stumbled through the Whiteout toward the trading post, hoping its larger structure might provide better shelter. By dawn of the second day, Silas Crawford made his decision. His children were in danger. Pride was irrelevant. He told Sarah to bundle the children, and they left their cabin, fighting through snow that was waist-deep in places. They could barely see 10 feet ahead. Silas navigated by memory, heading toward the hillside where Thornwell's buried shelter waited. Peter Donovan and his family left their cabin an hour later, making the same desperate journey. They met the Erickson family halfway, Lars carrying his youngest daughter because she could no longer walk through the deep snow. They stayed together, moving as a group toward the only shelter they knew would be warm. When they reached the low entrance in the hillside, Silas Crawford knelt in the snow and pounded on the P's outer door. He heard it open, then saw Cyrus Thornwell's face in the dim light of the tunnel. "My children are freezing," Silas said, his voice breaking. "Please." Cyrus stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come inside." 11 people sheltered in Cyrus Thornwell's earth chamber during the 3 days the Whiteout raged. The Crawford family, 5 in total, the Donovans, 4, Lars Erickson and his daughter, and Cyrus himself. The space that had seemed modest when Cyrus lived alone became crowded, but it remained warm. Cyrus maintained a steady fire, adding logs every few hours. The temperature held at 70 degrees without effort. The children, who had been shaking violently when they arrived, stopped shivering within an hour. Color returned to their faces. They fell asleep on blankets spread across the floor, exhausted but safe. The adults sat quietly, too tired for conversation, simply absorbing warmth that felt miraculous after what they had endured. On the 3rd day, the wind finally stopped. By afternoon, the snow had ended. Families emerged from the shelter into a world transformed. Drifts reached the eaves of some cabins. The settlement looked abandoned, buried under white. But the sky was clear, and the temperature was rising. They returned to their cabins to assess damage. Silas Crawford found his interior covered in frost. Everything was frozen solid. Peter Donovan's cabin had a collapsed section of roof where snow weight had broken through weakened poles. The Harrison family's cabin, abandoned earliest, was uninhabitable. Wind had torn off the door, and snow had filled the interior completely. Over the following week, 7 families began excavating their own earth shelters. They asked Cyrus questions about soil composition, support beam spacing, chimney angles, and drainage. He answered everything freely, showing them his design, explaining his reasoning. Silas Crawford selected a hillside near his ruined cabin and began digging without comment or apology. His actions spoke clearly enough. Lars Erickson worked alongside Cyrus for 2 weeks, learning the techniques, then began his own shelter with confidence. Peter Donovan chose a site near a creek bank where clay soil was abundant. Even John Harrison, who had lost his cabin completely, began excavating rather than rebuilding with logs. By the spring of 1858, 9 earth shelters existed in the settlement. By 1860, the number had grown to 16. Travelers passing through remarked on the strange community where settlers lived in hillsides like prairie dogs. But those settlers survived winters that killed people in traditional cabins just 20 miles away. Cyrus Thornwell died in June of 1873 at the age of 61. A fever took him quickly. He was buried on the hillside above his shelter, which by then had been occupied continuously for 17 years. Fewer than 30 people attended his funeral. No newspaper wrote about his passing. He left no children, no significant wealth, no formal legacy. But across the Northern Territories, scattered through Minnesota, the Dakota lands, and Montana, earth shelters continued protecting families through brutal winters. The technique spread without attribution, becoming simply how some people built in regions where cold killed without mercy. The innovation born from tragedy and mockery had become survival itself, carved into hillsides that would outlast the man who first understood their warmth.